is Musical Talk.
There are worlds where they live underwater, or worlds where technology's grown. You could live on the moon, and I've heard of a world with low gravity where you can jump really high. Apparently it's fun. There's a world that's all desert and a world where it always rains. Oh, and there's a world where the animals rule, but you probably won't go there. Slightly strange people go there. But also there are worlds just like you have come from, worlds not too far off your own. But wherever you go, I want you to know it will be your true home. Thus speaks Calicus, one of the characters in a new musical by Laura Tisdall, The In-Between. And that's what this week's episode is going to be about. I'm David Kingsmill, welcome to Musical Talk. And yes, this week we're discussing this brand new musical with music, lyrics and book, and indeed orchestrations, by Laura Tisdall. I thought I would use that introduction as it gives an opportunity to hear some of the fantastic lyrical description that Laura has used in The In-Between. That song, sung by Daniel Boyes, is called Out of Your World, and is one of the 7 tracks that is featured on the concept album that Laura has produced. I went to one of Thos and I's favourite interviewing grounds, the National Theatre, and met with Hadley Fraser and Lauren Samuels, both of whom sing on the concept album, as well as Laura herself, to discuss The In-Between. Somehow, despite the fact that when Thos and I go there it always seems to be peace and quiet, I managed to get screaming babies, moving scenery, and all other forms of random noise going on in the background, for which I apologise, particularly in the second half of the interview, after Hadley and Lauren had to leave when I spoke to Laura for a little bit. I've managed to take out the most offending segments, but I hope that the remaining noise that does still exist isn't too distracting from what I believe is a fascinating interview and an insight into the creation of a new musical. So, without further ado, let's hear from the 3 of them about The In-Between. Ladies first.
Hello. I am Lauren Samuels, and I have been playing the role of Flick in The In-Between.
Hi, I'm Laura Tisdall, and I wrote The In-Between, so I haven't been playing any roles. But that's a good thing.
Hi, I'm Hadley Fraser, and I sang, I think, one of 2 Calicuses. Am I right in saying that? It's one of 3. So it's kind of on a jobs share scheme. It's like a Calici, yeah.
Calici.
It's a bit of a sort of YTS format, but that's me.
Excellent, well thank you all very much for coming. Lauren and Hadley, obviously applicable to you guys. What's it like creating a character in a musical offstage?
Good question.
Very good question.
Yeah. I suppose you have to approach it like you would any other situation, really. I mean, obviously, Laura contacted each of us and said, would you come down and record this? And we were all sent through the music and sent through the score and sent through the script and so on and so forth. And she sent through a little sort of precede, script narrative, I suppose. And you just have to make your best judgment out of that. I mean, Laura was sort of peppering us with bits of direction as we went through the recording.
Yeah, Laura's been great helping us out as to kind of what's happened prior to the song we've sang or what happened after the song, So it's all down to Laura, really.
But yeah, I suppose that you just have to sort of approach it as a sort of condensed character formation like you would anything else, really.
Yeah, like you would for if you were just doing a monologue offhand or something like that. The preparation that you would do for that, same kind of thing.
Sure. So just to establish, this is something I'll talk to you about a bit more, Laura, but is the show actually finished?
Yes.
You've written everything, so it is a complete show, because obviously we've only got a concept recording.
So it's 2 acts, and we've done read-throughs. It's about 2.5 hours long.
Okay.
But,
so it's not a sort of halfway concept album, it's okay, we're done, now let's get some material out there.
It's I can only afford to record 7 songs concept album.
That seems perfectly fair.
Basically what I wanted to do was I wanted to be able to do enough of the music that people could get an idea of the story and if they might like it, but I didn't want to give away this is how it starts, this is how it middle, and this is how it ends. So there's none of the songs that sort of say how it ends up.
Right. Yes.
Because I wanted that to be, I don't know, it's very rare that you get to go and see a show and you don't know how it ends, because even if it's based on a pre-existing story, I kind of like that when you watch films and stuff and you don't know where it's going. Yeah.
Understood. Well, we'll come on to that a bit more when we're discussing sort of plots and things, and obviously not the end of the plot. So what? Obviously, a call from Laura in many ways, but what got you guys involved in this, and what was it that drew you into being part of this world?
Well, I already knew Laura previously. I'd done one of Laura's was it your first musical?
First musical
that Laura ever wrote.
Is that Fairy Tale?
Yeah, Fairy Tale. I was still training at GSA, and Laura came and auditioned some of us, and I actually played the lead in that at GSA. So then when Laura contacted me again to say I've written another musical, I was already like, great, I want to be involved, because Fairy Tale was so good and we had so much fun doing that. And then when I heard the song Someone You'd Be Proud Of, if you've heard it, I think you'll agree, it's a beautiful song, incredibly well written, and it just so happens that it fits perfectly in my range, so I was like, yes, I'll do that.
Convenient. And how about yourself?
I guess it's slightly different for me, not having known Laura before. I suppose I just listened through to the track and was really, really impressed by it. And just like Laura's just mentioned, I suppose there's part of me that quite likes supporting you writing, and given the fact that this was a show that has no prior incarnation as a film or something like that, it felt like quite a nice thing to be a part of in terms of something quite original and something that didn't necessarily come from anything else. So I suppose I'm quite brutal these days in terms of saying yes, that's something I'd like to be involved in, or no. But the track itself really sort of impressed me. Plus, I'd been doing a year of singing Javert down in my boots, and this was a little bit of an occasion where I could sort of wail up the top for a little while, so that was quite good fun. Yeah,
yeah, a change is as good as anything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, change is as good as the rest.
I suppose that therefore brings on a double question, which is what's it like creating a character as opposed to taking over from somebody who has established a character already? And what's it like creating a character that is completely fresh, as opposed to going into something that has been based on a film or a book? Because obviously here you really have had nothing but Laura's inspiration. Obviously you've had the benefit of working with the writer, but you've had nothing but what you've been told.
Yeah, well, what's great about that, I think, is that when you are the first person to do a role, although the writer will have this, ginormous idea of what they want, I think also Laura looks at something that we do as performers and goes, yeah, brilliant, that's what I was seeing. So you can kind of work together in creating something. And I was actually lucky enough to do a show recently where I was the first person ever to play it, and it is great because you can give your own input as well as the directors and the writers, and then you create something that all of you think's perfect. So
yeah, I think it's the most thrilling part of the process, really, creating a role that's entirely your sort of creation, really, obviously along with the authors themselves, but even doing something that's had a prior incarnation before, sometimes you're bound to a certain extent by that source material, whereas with something like this you really can, especially when you get up in a rehearsal situation, you really can get up and say, if you've got time, I know it's written like this, but I've been living with this character now for 3 weeks, and I sort of feel like at this moment he'd say this or he'd do this.
Yeah.
And what would that then impact for everything else? I don't know about you guys, but I find rehearsals is the most exciting part of the process. And so if you really do have a blank slate to work with, then that rehearsal period is even more exciting than a regular rehearsal period, I suppose. It's almost like once you get into doing shows, you can't change too much. I mean, obviously you can do something different every night, but you don't then have the ability to change what you've created, which you do in a rehearsal situation. That's the most thrilling. I mean, that's the reason why I think a lot of us are actors, quite frankly, just because you get to stand up in a rehearsal and play around.
yeah,
Ultimate creativity.
Yeah,
and explore all your imagination.
exactly.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to that bit, actually. I mean, it's difficult because when you've got 2 hours in the studio and you've got to record a song, you can't mess around too much.
Yeah.
But that's when it really comes alive. You kind of, I think, with writing a show, you write characters and you write lines, and you kind of have a hunch that it might work, and you sort of see it in your head. But it's only when you see someone do it and then they bring their own stuff to it that it really becomes obvious. Oh, that bit works, or that bit doesn't.
I think if things don't change in a rehearsal room, from the script that you had on the first day to the script that you had on the first night, then there's something fundamentally wrong with your process, because obviously something's going to change when you get it up on its feet and you're acting it and you're thinking through the intention far more I suppose vividly than you would be otherwise. I've done shows where that has been the case. Stuff hasn't changed from the first day of rehearsals to the first night, and actually they've been the ones that haven't been as successful.
Right.
It's the ones where everybody is collaborating to come up with something in the studio that has changed, that changes and is still changing during previews and stuff like that. Obviously, at some point you have to lock it down for everyone's sanity.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
But I'll stop waffling.
No, not at all. Well, actually, again, it brings me on to something, and I know this is something that you're involved in, which is writing. And obviously, because this is such a creative thing to be doing. Hadley, I know you write. Lauren, have you written at all?
I had to write a play for my dissertation at college.
Okay.
And that's it.
Is it something you would get into, or is
I do actually really enjoy writing. And I write a lot of. Sometimes I write songs. It depends how busy I am. It's something that I really enjoy to do when I've got the time, but often I don't have time to sit down and give it its full attention.
I sort of got into writing. I mean, I did an English literature degree, so that was always something that was part of it as well. And I suppose sometimes you have to sort of almost adopt a different role. I think everything informs everything else in this business. So if you are an actor who writes, very often if you're doing new work or an actor who directs, it can inform you as a collaborative actor. I hope that I would never walk into a rehearsal studio as an actor and be too annoying about trying different things, because at some point you do have to say, okay, my role is to interpret what this person is writing. But by the same token, if you have written yourself, I suppose you've then got a little route into perhaps just suggesting maybe how something might work. I think that's the thing you've got to be quite careful of as well. It's suggesting to the author, would there be any mileage in this? And if the author turns around to you and says, no, because I want it like that, at some point you have to say, okay, fine, because this is your thing.
Yeah.
And I know that when I'm writing, that's what I like.
Yeah, sure.
Is actors who turn around and say, what about this? And you have to be quite honest and you say, actually, yeah, that's a much better idea than my one. But then at some points you do have to say, you know what, this is the way I want it. I suppose.
And has that happened much in this? Has there been points where, Laura, have actors changed your mind about how something's going to go?
I mean, I think it's one of those things, because it was a very limited time. We didn't have too much to say, let's try this and let's try that. But as I said, I think Addie's got it just right. It's the whole thing is a collaboration, and like my goal is to be part of a show that is good at the end. And you know, I don't think that I have all the best ideas for that. If someone else comes up with a better way of doing a scene, great, the show will be better, let's use it. You know, I just really think that...
But you were great in the studio, Laura, with sort of saying, oh, actually, she's much more aggressive in this part, you know, I don't know how you found it, but particularly with me, you know, Laura would say, you know, at this point in the story, Flick really has got nothing left, and, you know, blah, blah, blah. So that was really helpful to get the intention across. And it's hard on a recording to, you know, for someone to listen and to hear the frustration or whatever. But I think we do have it in certain places, certainly on my track, where you can hear.
There's one line I love where you say, "I was, if something needed saving, I was not the one you'd pick."
Yeah.
And just like there are bits where you really like hear the character in it and stuff. And I think something we found with like recording all the songs is that in recording you really have to go over the top almost to get it across, because you don't have that visual element. Like it's all got to be from the voice.
It's much less forgiving as well, I suppose, to a certain extent, recording something that's going to be recorded forever.
Yes.
If you're doing something in a rehearsal studio, or to a certain extent if you're doing a performance, most of what you're doing can be put across from acting, and I think probably should be. It should be an intention-based thing, but obviously if you're recording something for its musical worth, to a certain extent sometimes you've got to stand there and go, do you know what, I actually really need to concentrate on getting this note out. That's also hard, isn't it? So sometimes you're actually not necessarily thinking as you might usually do as an actor. Sometimes you're thinking more of a recording artist.
Sure.
Particularly when you have to do the highest note over and over again.
At 10 o'clock in the morning.
It's a very sort of commendable series of attitudes, really, that whole conversation. And it comes, I think there's something in it as well, isn't there, in the actor's mindset of you need to know more, because it doesn't matter. You're right in the sense of it doesn't necessarily show that you're putting all of this in, but at the same time it would show more if it wasn't there.
Yeah.
And I suppose there's a similar amount of that from the recording artist's perspective.
Yeah, absolutely.
Of you need to have it in your voice.
Yeah, yeah. And then hopefully it transfers across, whether it does or not. You never know.
It has to be story told because of the nature of the plot, I think. What of the plot we can gather and what is written down, and I think, it really comes across for me.
I agree, definitely. Like, I mean, as I said, it's like when you write a song, you kind of have a hunch that it might work, but it's hearing someone doing it and putting that like character in. It's one of the most amazing experiences. Like, it really is. Just to, like, we did West End Live this weekend, and I was just sort of standing there backstage with people rushing around, just watching like people sing the songs really well, including Lauren. And it's surreal. Everyone's rushing around you, and it's very strange to just see that happen. But really wonderful at the same time.
I'll talk a little more about the West End Live, certainly from your perspective, in a moment. But Lauren, what was it like actually singing something on West End Live that isn't one of the big West End? Because I think I'm right in saying they had every single West End show represented, plus other stuff. And amongst that other stuff is the in-between. And so you've got something that people only know if they've heard the recording, or they know one of you guys and you've told them about it. How was that received?
It was incredibly nerve-wracking. I can't tell you how nervous I was. Really nervous. I mean, I'd never performed at West End Live anyway, so I was nervous about that experience. But when you're performing in a show, you're doing it every single night, and just performing on West End Live is nothing really, because you do the show every night and you know exactly what's going to happen. But this is the first time that this song was ever sung live, and of course I'd done it in the studio, but when you record in the studio you do it in small sections. So this was also the first time that I was singing the song as a whole and creating the journey from start to finish. So yeah, it was really nerve-wracking, but it was so well received. The music has been so well received since its release date that actually a lot of the audience already knew the song that I was going to be singing, and so I was really surprised at how well received it was.
Yeah, that was cool. Like, I mean, talking about surreal experiences, like on the first day when they said the in-between and people cheered, and I was like, what? This is a random show I wrote in my bedroom. It's like, so, and I was like, that can't have just been my parents, there was so...
There's so many avenues now whereby people can come across this music, though, isn't there? And come across, I mean, the rise of social networking, I suppose, has led this to happen. Certainly something that, like, even 5 years ago, people wouldn't know about.
No, exactly.
People wouldn't have known about West End Live as much as they do. So now you've got this great ability, and especially if it's decent writing, which it always most definitely is.
Yeah.
People come across it and they think something new.
Yeah.
And something that I can follow almost from its inception. And I think that's really thrilling from that point of view.
Yeah.
And also having you guys in it is going to really help. I mean, I found out about it. I picked up one of the little long flyers from Dress Circle at some point in time.
Yeah.
I'm a fantasy nerd. I saw something that clearly looked slightly fantasy related, picked it up and put it in my pocket. And I don't know how much I would have thought about it if my fiancée hadn't spotted it on the table and got Hadley Fraser's in that. Genuinely, I'm not just saying that. That's really good, and I went and downloaded it that night, and that's how I came across it. So I think having names like yourselves,
word of mouth as well,
But here's the other thing, to a certain extent. I mean, I don't want this to sound disingenuous, but I don't feel as if I'm a name. Do you know what I mean? That's the other thing that social networking has done for you. So fans of the theatre can now almost create their own community within which people like myself and Lauren, people have more contact with us, and so are able to keep up with what we do a little bit more. If you compare yourself with a proper name, a household name of an actor who people would know about, there's no comparison really. But something like this, I think, it's almost democratising how we interact with all of these things an awful lot more, because you're able to search out the stuff that really thrills you, rather than just search out the stuff that's being made, and if you like it, great. Am I making sense here? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You can really search out what it is that you love and follow it so much more closely because of social networking. I'm waffling again.
A question, and this is something either join in now or I might ask you again, is what's the future of a show like this? Where does it go next?
Well, I hope that it can eventually get off its feet and be in a theatre somewhere, so that everyone who's heard and invested and bought this music, as well as ourselves, can actually watch it and watch the journey. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's the dream, to see it put on I hope the album would be a step towards that. I mean, it's interesting because, again, like Hadley was saying, like last 5 years particularly, this stuff's been able to happen more. But they did like concept albums in like the 70s, that was sort of what kind of gave me the idea, like with the Evita concept album, that they released the album first, and then because they weren't quite sure whether people would be interested in that story, and then like Don't Cry for Me Argentina was a big hit, and then they brought it to stage. And I just thought it's kind of interesting that people haven't really done that. You've had this massive explosion with the internet and music sharing, so it's like the perfect time that people can hear the songs for free, you can get it out for free, and particularly as it's so expensive to stage a show, or even just like with scripts, a kind of workshop.
Yeah.
So it's
a great way for people to come into contact with the music.
Yeah. And
for the show to almost become known even prior to the show actually happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And have you actually workshopped? You said earlier you've done some read-throughs. Has there been a workshop of any sort?
No, I haven't had. So it's on about, I think it's the 4th draft now.
Right.
So various people have looked at it and things.
Plans to put it on its feet?
That's my next step. We'll see. To be honest, I think I'm going to
time.
Of course, yes.
I'm going to take a week off, and then that's my next.
Well deserved, I would imagine.
Workshop's terrifying, though, I think, from a writing point of view, because you really are putting your soul on the line for people to come in and say, this is terrible.
Yeah.
And you have to sort of be prepared to have quite thick skin. I mean, the one thing that I've written that has been workshopped, I don't think I slept that entire week. Because then you go home and you're rewriting stuff that's come up from that particular day, but also you're worried about putting your own work in front of people. I mean, I suppose for you, Laura, to a certain extent you've already done that, and you've seen the reaction that people have had from it, so that must give you a certain amount of confidence to do it.
I mean, it's one of those things, like I said before, I know I'm not going to have the best ideas for everything. I think you come into the rehearsal room with hopefully like a framework and hopefully quite a few bits that would work.
Yeah.
But
you don't know until you do that workshop, though, I suppose, do you? And these days I think you sort of have to do one, at least one.
Yeah.
Really. It's sort of crucial, really.
So there you go, a workshop. Do a workshop.
Do a workshop.
Will you guys be involved if one is done?
Well,
If you're
definitely.
free, of course.
Depends if Laura wants us.
If we're invited.
Yeah. I'm on a job sharing role at the moment, so I don't know.
But if the opportunity did present itself?
Absolutely.
Of course. It's always thrilling to be part of that situation. Workshops are almost better than the shows themselves. Like I said about rehearsals, workshops are the most exciting things, I think.
And this is sort of something coming on to something which is I'm looking at quite a lot at the moment, which is the state of British musical theatre. Our listeners will know I'm working on at the moment bits and short interviews with people here and there about British musical theatre and where it's going. A difficult question perhaps, but what do you think the immediate future would be in a putting it on its feet stage of a show like this in an environment where there have been some successful British musicals that haven't lasted as long as they deserve to? I've talked recently on Musical Talk about Love Story, about Betty Blue Eyes. It seems like people are slightly hesitant to try something new. And yet you have this prior knowledge of this show, and it's, to a certain extent, has already been accepted musically. So what do you think effect that might have on the procedure of this, if you like?
Musicals are now that are only staying on are all the ones that Joe Bloggs knows, the Olivers and all stuff like that everybody knows. So it is going to be incredibly difficult to get a musical like this. But I think Laura's gone about it the right way, releasing the album, because that is what attracts people to a show, isn't it? They go, oh, I know those songs, I'll go along and sing them, as I watch it. So it's difficult to say.
Yeah, I think there's a big difference to be made in terms of where the industry is nowadays and where it was, say, in the 80s and the 90s when all these mega musicals were coming out, and some of them are still around and some of them we've been in, which is fine. I think the difficulty is telling anybody what to do with their money, whether you be an audience member or indeed a producer, because musicals cost so much these days. Producers have to be really, really certain that if they're putting it into specifically a West End venue, I think they have to be almost entirely certain that they feel like they're going to have a return for their money. But I think there's one thing that's happening more and more these days is that there's almost a sort of off West End thing happening, which I think is massively healthy, which hasn't quite been the case for the West End, I think, in the same context that off-Broadway has been for Broadway.
Sure.
You know, there's been an awful lot of off-Broadway shows that we would all know of by name and that have done great things for their authors and their composers.
Yeah.
And I think the same is beginning to happen here, especially because we're beginning to see more and more venues that are able to sort of promote themselves as off-West End venues. You've got two more coming in the next year, the St James in Victoria and the Park up in Frimsby. You know, these are 300, 400 seat venues.
Yeah.
And like Taboo is coming back
Exactly.
at Brixton Academy, you know, that'll do.
Well, and I think if a new show like the In-Between is able to find itself on at somewhere like the St James, for instance, which I really don't think is out of the bounds of possibility at all, if it then becomes a success there, then I think that transfer then becomes a different thing. I think we have to stop thinking about musicals coming out of nowhere and going into the West End.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily think that's a terrible thing. What is more exciting about it is the fact that even places like this, we're here at the National, are actually beginning to do more musicals. You look at London Road, there's the Tori Amos one that's happening next year. Mm-hmm. Places like this are beginning to become more sort of musically aware as well. And so things like the In-Between, if they find themselves on at somewhere like this, then the possibility of transferring later on happens. So actually I think to say that the state of musical theatre is in ill health at the moment is not quite true. I mean, even places like Waterloo East, which had Departure Lounge and all of these places, you know, Departure Lounge has gone on to be done in Chicago and all over the place, and you sort of think, okay, maybe we just have to slightly readjust our expectations of these things. Not readjust wanting our things to be a success and the potential for them in the future, but just the roadmap to getting them on might be slightly different these days.
Yeah. And also I think there's a benefit to this one with having the connection with the drama school. Because I saw, with Thos, we went to see In Touch, talking of Departure Lounge, another Dougal Irvin, was at Edinburgh 2 years ago, and we saw it done by the Musical Theatre Academy at the Bridewell just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that having that drama school connection there, where he's obviously MTA like putting new stuff out, perhaps there's a because you immediately have a captive potential cast.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a great
And they're
idea.
going to get, you know, hello, here's a job for me coming out of drama school. They're going to jump for something like this.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, that's, I mean, without being able to do fairy tale at uni with GSA, like, I wouldn't have been able to do any of the further stuff. That was literally the foot in the door. So that was great.
Laura, discussing the In-Between, tell the listeners, for those who haven't hunted it out on the website or something, a little bit about the plot.
Can I read the bit from the flyer?
You can read the bit from the flyer. No, that's not really lame.
I'm saying I just say it in a ridiculous fashion that doesn't make any sense. I'm just going to read from the flyer. So it's a quirky tale of love, friendship and letting go. The In-Between is a fancy musical telling the story of sarcastic misfit Flick Wimple, a perpetually underachieving 19-year-old who stumbles through the wrong doorway and finds herself trapped in between parallel worlds. Desperately searching for a way home, Flick must overcome new challenges as she finds help in unexpected places and is forced to confront her troubled past. There we go.
A very intriguing plot, and perhaps a little unusual in terms of musical theatre, in terms of what's sort of currently around at the West End. Partly for fantasy. Obviously, we have The Wizard of Oz, although that's established. We have Wicked, although that's based on The Wizard of Oz. So a lot of the fantastical stuff that's around at the moment has a prior pedigree before it hits the stage.
Yeah.
Here you are, fresh, new fantasy story, not heard before. Why fantasy?
To be honest, I've done fantasy because I love fantasy.
Good call.
It's one of those things, I know probably the sensible thing, I guess if people want to be successful, I guess the sensible thing would be to do what kind of thing is popular, let's write that. But to be honest, that's not why I write musicals. I write musicals because I want to tell particular stories, and I think music can really heighten particular kinds of stories. And so I wrote this story that I would want to see. That, as I said, maybe that's not very sensible or whatever, but but that's the reason that I wrote it.
More enjoyable for you in the long run, I would have thought, rather than feeling you have to write something.
Yeah, I just think, that's why I wrote it.
And we'll come back to this in a minute, but obviously you have the pedigree of fantasy, because you do have the first musical that you wrote, Fairy Tale, which was put on at the Guildford School of Acting.
Yeah.
How did you start writing?
Well, to be honest, I saw Les Mis and was like, that was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. Nothing has made me feel that way. I have to be part of this world. It was one of those lightning strike. It was in I Dreamed a Dream. I just thought the tune on the line, but the tigers come at night, that tune, I was just like, what the hell was that? Play it again. Do you know what I mean? And I just came out of there, and the next day started writing Fairy Tale. Just out of the blue. I mean, I'd written lots of music before. I was in a band, and I'd written stories separately before, so I suppose it wasn't that much of a leap to stick the two together.
Well, yes and no, because you're working with a very different medium. Yes, you're telling a story, and in many ways a story can be converted onto the stage, but you do have music as well. And so, obviously, you've said there that you've had prior experience. How easy did you find it to start writing musical theatre?
To be honest, it's one of those things I didn't overthink it, really. I just did it. I didn't think, I'm going to start writing a show and it's going to do this, this and this. I just started writing it. I mean, the first show, it's kind of a ridiculous way of doing it, but I didn't even start writing a score. I did it in Cubase. So I was literally playing the music in and writing a script at the same time, like on my laptop. And I just did it. So I didn't overthink it. I mean, I know that sounds ridiculous. And,
no, not at all.
I wouldn't work that way now. I learnt a lot from doing that.
And you got something written, which I think is where many people, and I can hold my hand up here and say I'm horribly jealous of you, because I have fallen foul of this, I overthink. And you do. It's much harder to get something written, and yes, it may not be the best thing you've ever written, but the first thing you write very rarely is. So I can imagine you did take an awful lot of experience from that.
Yeah, I mean, there are lots of things that I would do differently. But I suppose it's one of those things, not to sound too cheesy. I'm proud of that show, and there are things that I would change in it. But it was really wonderful for me to be able to see when GSA perform bits of it and stuff. That that was a really wonderful thing. So I'm proud of that whole experience, or pleased that it happened.
Understandably so. And did you feel, when you did see GSA putting this on, did you feel that you'd sort of begun to arrive at where you'd wanted to be when you'd been in the audience in Les Mis?
Talk about surreal experiences. I remember, when I went to the first rehearsal for it, and we were doing a big ensemble song first, and just suddenly there's all these amazing singers. There was a lot of third years, so a lot of them went straight into sort of the Western afterwards, Lauren included, and they all just stood up and started singing this song, and I was just literally, I'd heard choir noises sing it before, sort of, ah. So yeah, it was just, it's a really wonderful experience when that happens.
And you said you've been in a band. Had you performed in musicals before, or has your experience in musicals literally been writing?
Yeah, no, I haven't performed in musicals. It was strange. When I was little, I loved acting. I was always wanting to be in the school play and everything, got really excited. And then I went to secondary school and just got stage fright and didn't do it anymore. I don't know why it was. And then about 14, 15, just started playing in a rock band, and sort of sung and play guitar. So yeah, but I hadn't really done the whole musical theatre performance. I did singing at university, not as, I didn't do a performance degree, but I had lessons while I was there.
Sure.
And that was when I started singing musical theatre stuff. But I'm really glad I did that, because I think having at least an understanding of how the voice works with that kind of thing does help you to write songs that are in good places for people's voices, and having your big note on in a particular place. And that's
absolutely. Who are your musical influences?
Lots of people. From the musical theatre side, I love Andrew Lloyd Webber stuff. I love Phantom and Evita. I just think he writes great tunes, and I love the orchestrations as well. I love Wicked. I think Stephen Schwartz is an absolute genius. The score of that is just brilliant. But also, I like Jason Robert Brown. I think the last 5 years is one of my favourite shows. I really like Little Women, the Broadway the Broadway one. I never saw it, but I love that CD. So there's that side of things as well, but because of like my musical background, there's also a lot of the rock side.
Right.
So like Muse, Evanescence, Nightwish. There's a lot of bands that did sort of fusing kind of orchestral or that kind of large scale epic-y music.
On that
with
side,
rock
it seems we
bands.
share the same influences, actually.
Well,
Not that
but
I
I
use
mean-
them in my musical theatre,
But
but
the thing is, I know it seems very strange to say, rock, almost metal music and musical theatre, but they're both really theatrical. Like and they're often the lyrics are really story based.
yeah.
And so I don't think it's so much of a leap.
No, well, something that actually, a little story I came across recently, which will interest you and maybe some of our listeners who prefer the slightly rockier soundtracks. There's a band called Vandenplas, who are based in, I think they're from Holland. Their lead singer broke off and did a solo album called Abydos, Abydos. I can't remember the full name of the album, but it's very musical theatre. I found a track of it by accident, and it's extremely musical theatre. And I found out doing some research that a group, either in Holland or Germany, I think, actually took the songs from that album and literally just put them on stage in much the same way, I suppose, that one would have done with We Will Rock You or Mamma Mia. But this is much more in the lines, it's not quite a Finnish power metal band, but it's still more on the metal side than it is the old style rock. And it's been put on stage as it is.
Yeah.
So, I think that you're absolutely right. The leap is minimal, and many rock concerts are extraordinarily theatrical in the way they're presented. So how long have you been writing this? And obviously, also you said you don't write the way that you had done with the sort of spontaneity, so how do you write now as well?
Well, the show took me about a couple of years to write, but at the same time I was finishing my degree, so I finished it about a year ago, but so parts of that I was obviously not writing so much.
Sure.
So I started writing almost exactly about 3 years ago, and I suppose that I thought out the story a lot more before I started this time. So I think the thing I found with Fairy Tale is I was doing lots of rewrites for bits I'd already written the music for, and so it's not just we'll change that script and delete that bit. It's I've got to score out a whole more 5 minutes of music or something. So so from a practical point of view, if you can try and get a lot of story revisions done before you write the music, I think that's it's a more practical way of doing it, being realistic. That said, sometimes I find that hard. So the first draft I had a full script and 4 songs, because some bits just, I don't know, you sort of, like, I might just be playing on the piano and you kind of get an idea and stuff, so you don't want to just say, no, I'm not going to write a song yet. So, I mean, the show has changed an awful lot since that first draft anyway. So in a sense it's quite difficult to just say, right, script's done, now we're going to move on to this, because it does change. People read it and say, what about this? Yeah, so...
But then, as Hadley was saying earlier, a script that isn't willing to evolve is rather trapping itself in most cases, other than those genius writers, in always being mediocre. So there's nothing wrong, I think, with a script that continuously changes.
I think the thing is, every draft of a show you put out, you think it's the best it can be, because that's why you've chosen to do that scene that way. And then someone will say to you, but why does that happen, or why is that? And you suddenly think, and then like new ideas start coming up and stuff. So I think it's something very early on with musical theatre that you've got to get over that, really. Like, and I think there's also, I think it works both ways in the people who you show your work to, and or people that you're working on your show with. I think there are nice ways to say, have you thought about doing this bit differently, as opposed to, this is rubbish and could never work. So I think, there's a sense where it's important you think about who you work with and things, and that you get on and that you're able to work together. So I think that's important as well. I think there are nice ways to tell people bits could be improved, but I think there's also, it's very difficult not to take it personally, because if you spent 2 years working on something, you do feel very protective of it.
And understandably so.
But it's that thing that ultimately I want to be part of creating a good show, and I want the end show to be as good as it can be. And if other people have got better ideas for how things will work better, then let's use that and let's make the best show that we can.
And I think that's perhaps something that a lot of people don't necessarily understand, is how much of yourself you put in when you're writing, and how vulnerable you have to be willing to make yourself to actually put yourself in a situation where someone can come up to you and say, that's not very good, or if they're less tactless, that's rubbish. Which hopefully you don't get, and certainly I think would not be deserved for this. But even so, just having someone coming up saying, well, I would have done this differently, or why don't you try this, there's a certain hit that you take with that, as you say.
Yeah, I mean, to an extent it's always going to feel a bit personal, but I don't know, I think you've got to be able to say, okay, they think that, right, now how do we move forward? Yeah, I think just getting really upset about it, although that's your gut feeling, is say, no, you're wrong, shut up, go away, you're stupid. But, I mean, often it's because the thing they've said is the thing that you knew all along was wrong with it, and didn't want to admit. But I think the other thing is as well is that people have different opinions. If someone says to you, this show is terrible, it will never work, they might be right, but it doesn't mean they're right. I love shows that people hate. Do you know what I mean? Like,
of course.
I think Wicked is brilliant, but I think it had quite mixed reviews when it came out. There are people who don't like it. Like Les Mis, I think, is the show that changed my life. When it came out, loads of the critics hated it.
Yes.
So I think, if a show like that sort of polarises opinion, and it doesn't mean that it's a bad show. I'm not saying that my show is like Les Mis and anyone who says it's wrong is wrong. I think you have to start out thinking, okay, there are going to be people who this isn't their cup of tea.
Yeah.
Not everyone likes fantasy. I think it's interesting, actually, the point you made about fantasy musicals earlier, because although there aren't a lot of fantasy musicals, in every other genre, film, book, TV, fantasy is huge.
Yes.
Which is from where I like it so much is from books, TV shows, films. So in a way, I think it's strange that there aren't more fantasy shows.
I'm inclined to agree with you, because my sort of most prominent fantastical heritage is books. Films, I seem to be more science fiction-y. And there again, actually, science fiction musicals, also not particularly common, and yet they're rife elsewhere. Do you have any opinion as to what might be the cause of that?
I think it's partly to do with the commercial risk in putting on a show. To do a fantasy musical is going to be a lot more expensive. Although there are ways you can do things without being too expensive, but I think it's going to be more expensive than, say, a two-hander that's about a relationship or something. So I think there's a fundamental thing there about what's safe and also the cost of putting on something. So I think that's. But I think it's also it's doing something, being the first person to do something different, and not being sure it'll be a hit. It's much easier to do, or much safer to do, a revival, or let's do a historical style show, because it's more comfortable, it's safer.
Well, and I think also there's something that The In-Between has going for it in the fantasy sense is something that I discussed with Thos after we saw In Touch. In Touch, if you don't know it, is a musical by Dougal Irvin, and it is science fiction. What that show did, and what I get the sense The In-Between could do, is it essentially tells a story which doesn't have to be fantasy, or doesn't have to be science fiction. It could be told in contemporary, standard, modern world that we're in now. Therein, do you think, perhaps, there's more in a fantasy that is truer to life in theatre at the moment?
I think the thing about really good fantasy stories, or from my point of view, the ones that really grab me, it's always about the characters. And so when I started writing the show, I had Flick, who's the main character, Alice, her sister, and Calicus, who's the guy they meet, or that Flick meets in the In-Between, which is a place between parallel worlds. And I knew how they started off, and I knew what happens in the middle, and I knew how it ended. That's not changed. How you facilitate that character change happening and the developments happening is almost, that's like the nuts and bolts that you work out. But the central thing is the characters. And like you say, you could set that, there are different ways that you could set it to get that character development. I quite like fantasy settings. I think I quite said settees there. Fancy settings.
Yes.
Fancy settings. I think they're quite cool. It's just interesting seeing a world, like watching a world where the rules aren't the same.
Yeah.
Different things can happen. So I think that's quite cool in itself. But if you just have that, you're never going to have a story that really tugs on you emotionally.
Did any of your characters surprise you while you were writing it?
Interesting question. I've never thought about that. Flick, often what she says is what I would say.
Right.
I'm quite sarcastic, I suppose. So she's probably, if I'd had the start that she had and didn't have a kind of social filter on what I said, it would probably come out as what she said.
Fair enough.
So in a sense, she was always quite, I think I knew what she was like.
Yes.
I think Calicus was probably took a bit longer to find what he was like, really.
Well, is that partly because therein you have, from what I understand of the plot, your most central, for want of a better phrase, non-human character, or non this world character? Because he, if I'm not mistaken, he inhabits the in-between.
Yeah, it's a bit, if you think of it kind of like purgatory, but between parallel worlds.
Yeah.
So he's one of the guides who lead people through. So he spent his whole life, they don't age, they just sort of exist there. He spent his whole life just leading people and being told this person goes there, this person goes there, and he's never questioned anything.
Yeah.
And then Flick comes along and who sort of isn't supposed to be there,
right,
and so argues with everything he tells her. And so it goes off script and he doesn't know what on earth to do, and he's like, you're supposed to be here, sort of thing. And so it's interesting because he's an incredibly naive character when you start off, because like no one's ever lied to him or anything. He doesn't have a sort of concept of that. So that was quite interesting, I think, to try and work out at what point would he get different things. Like, so you've got him and then you've got Flick, who's incredibly sarcastic, so obviously takes everything she says literally. So it's working out at what point does he get what she's saying, at what point does he start questioning. So I suppose that's quite interesting, and that's something I'd really look forward to developing in the rehearsal room with like whoever ends up playing him if we get to do the show. That's something that I'd really look forward to developing.
Absolutely.
Particularly that character, yeah.
Because there's in many ways there are parallels there to everyday life, if you like, because it could almost be seen as challenging someone's religious faith after a fashion. What out of that made him such a difficult character to find?
I think it's one of those things where people often say, like, write what you know. So Flick, as I said, her lines were quite easy because it's like, well, what would I say if I was feeling a bit bratish? So that's that comes quite naturally. But it's trying to think, okay, so get into the mind of someone who's, conformed to this way of life. His whole life. It's something sort of alien to me.
Sure.
So it's trying to work out, well, what would he say, and trying to make his decisions logical and coherent. So it's trying to develop this whole new persona, which isn't something that I've experienced. So I think that's...
Sure. And what came to you first in the creation process of the show?
Do you mean in terms of story, or...?
Well, J.K. Rowling, you often hear quoted as saying that Harry Potter just walked into her head one day, fully formed, and there was a character, and everything got built around him. Yeah. What was that? What was the point of inception, if you like, of the idea into your mind?
It's really strange because I don't know.
Right.
I try and think back and sort of, I suppose, like, when was Flick as a character born? And I think I knew that I wanted my main character to be different than the main character I had in Fairy Tale.
Right.
Who I suppose was more like Calicus, was a fairy princess character who spent her life kind of trapped in this castle, as fairy princesses often do.
Of course, yeah. Where else would they live?
So she was the naive character.
Yeah.
And this time I thought, no, I want, a female lead who's quite strong and gutsy and says exactly what she thinks, even when it's really, really not the best thing to say. but so I suppose it did sort of come out of wanting to, I wanted a main character that I think she's quite a funny person as well, which was different again. Fairy Tale was a very serious show. It was sort of like a kind of dark gothic take on fairy tales, sort of pre-Disney-ified fairy tales.
Sure.
So I think the sort of tone of it came, although there are, some very, I suppose, serious themes in it, I wanted that person to be able to laugh, or I didn't want to, I thought it needs to have humour in it because there are quite serious themes. It needs to have funny bits, but I didn't want it to be a kind of contrived, and now we have the funny bit, and now I wanted it to be more of a sort of an intrinsic, just a part of who she was, the sort of things that she would say.
Yeah.
So I think that's maybe where it came from in terms of the character.
Fair enough.
It's quite hard to think. It's one of those things I should know, shouldn't I?
Well, no, not necessarily.
But,
I think it depends how. I mean, obviously, it sounds like Flick came to you was sort of the first main thing of the show to come to you, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you know where the show actually. Sometimes I think it's quite a lucid moment where you suddenly go, hang on, I should write about this. But there are some things down the line, and I have thought, where did that come from? And I think many people probably think the same thing. Yeah. Especially if an idea comes to you last thing at night or during the night, and you wake up in the morning and you think, oh my god, I had this amazing dream. Or
no, I think that's definitely true. I think the thing with the in-between is I had the idea of it, the idea for it gradually developed while I was still working on Fairy Tale.
Right.
So it wasn't that I had the idea and this is what I'm going to write. It was I had the idea, but I'm working on this other thing.
Sure.
So sort of in the back of my mind, things are gradually sort of ticking over and developing.
Well, that probably makes it harder as well, because obviously your mind was focusing on what you were writing, as opposed to this little figment of something crawling around at the back.
Well, I suppose it was more. I think I'd probably actually written Fairy Tale at that point,
okay.
But I was like recording bits of it. Or,
right.
So I was focusing on this on the other show. Actually, it would have been we were doing the showcase for it.
Okay,
so,
fair enough.
That sort of consumed my life for 3 months working on
Understandable
scores for that and things.
I'll come back to Fairy Tale in a moment actually, but there's one thing I wanted to ask about the In-Between as well, which is, do the other worlds feature? Because you talk about these parallel worlds. Is it just the In-Between and our world, or do we travel to other worlds during the course of it?
The show itself is set. It's in the In-Between and in our world. Mm-hmm. I don't want to give too much away.
No, understandable.
But yeah, so it's the majority is the In-Between and our world. But I think the In-Between's quite like an otherworldly place.
Oh yeah.
I sort of think of it as like it's this place where everything that gets lost ends up. So
interesting idea. I
so
like that.
People who get lost get stuck in the In-Between.
Okay.
And lost keys and everything. So you
intriguing.
So I think it's this place that's got all these sort of various lost people, lots of things floating around.
Sure.
So.
And what about Fairy Tale? Is there any future in that? Or we've already sort of touched on the future of the In-Between, and obviously your next project for that will be the workshop. Is Fairy Tale going to get brought back to life, so to speak?
It's one of those things. I really like some of the music for it, and I really like the idea of a sort of old-fashioned fairy tale, like doing a musical on that kind of thing. But I think the book needs quite a lot of work.
Right.
It's interesting. I think it's something that I'd quite like to work on someone else with.
Right. Okay.
With someone else. Oh, that didn't make sense. Yeah. I would quite like to work on with someone else. There we go. I'd almost like to say, here's what I wrote. What do you think? And they might come up with a different spin or somewhere, a different way that we could go with it. Yeah, I mean, it's something that I might
In
come
time,
back
perhaps.
to. Yeah.
Yeah. One thing I've been wondering about with The In-Between is how are you publicising so effectively, bearing in mind that you don't have a show in a West End
Yeah.
theatre? Because, I mean, loads of people I've talked to in the MT circuit know about it. And you say, oh, The In-Between. They say, oh, yeah, I've heard about that.
Yeah.
Or I've heard that. Or I saw that at West End Live. But obviously that all came from somewhere.
Basically, The In-Between has kind of been my life for 5 months. So, I don't know what to say really. I mean, we haven't got any commercial backing for it or anything like that. It's literally been, I've emailed people, we've been handing out flyers. I've had some very nice friends and family members willing to, stand in the West End handing out flyers. Or, sending posters round theatres, taking posters round backstage at West End theatres and things like that. And, a lot has been social media online with Facebook and Twitter, and the actors have really helped out with, like tweeting about it and things like that.
Yeah.
And also the people that have heard about it and liked it have been amazing and then like telling their friends about it. So, we've had a lot of people who've been really supportive and just really helped us out. Thank you. But yeah, so I think there's a lot of things that you can do for free if you're being prepared to really work at it. I've done lots of sort of 6-day weeks working till 10, 11 doing it. I think that's the thing, you've got to be so determined. It's just a variety of things. But just, I sort of thought, I've got to try my best at this. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. But then, then I'll know that I did the best that I could.
It seems to have worked thus far, at any rate. What about, though, obviously a mind as obviously creative as yours is, do you have something else hovering back there yet to come out, or are you...
New show?
Yeah, or even concept, not necessarily show yet.
Yes. Well, there was, about having had the idea for The In-Between a long time before I wrote it, there were 2 ideas that I had about the same time. I think actually I probably had the idea for the other one before The In-Between, and I wrote The In-Between first because it will be cheaper.
Good call.
Well, I mean, in terms of you can do it with a smaller cast and a smaller band, and you do have to look at practicalities a bit.
Well, shows have their moments. They have their point where circumstances are right to be able to do something with them.
I think that's the thing. Realistically, you're not going to get a producer who's going to invest in a show with a cast of 30 and a band of 20 for a new writer on a new story. So you sort of, I think you have to be a bit realistic about it.
Although I think there is a certain element to which you can attract interest, even if someone doesn't invest, in the knowledge that you have an idea.
Yeah.
Because I know I went to the National Theatre's literary department meeting up in Edinburgh last year, and they were very excited at the concept of anybody who talked about a show being bigger than 4 people, because of course most people who write new shows write for 4 because that's affordable.
It's an interesting thing, I think, striking the right balance, because I've always had the dilemma in that the shows that I love are generally they're the big shows. I mean, I love The Last 5 Years, which is just 2 people, but I love Les Mis, Wicked, Phantom, like the big epic stories, big epic shows with massive casts and things. And it's that sort of thing about why am I writing a show? And I want to write the kind of show that I would want to see, but it's difficult when that kind of show is intrinsically requiring a big cast and I suppose would be quite expensive. So what I've tried to do with The In-Between is it's that kind of story, like quite a big scale story, but I think you could do it with minimum cast, you could do it with 12 people.
Okay.
And band of 7. I've been very strict with myself, even though often I want a French horn, but I've not let myself have one.
Oh no, that's tough.
I love
French horns are always good to have.
So we've gone with a trombone who's covering the brass section. But and I really want another percussionist. But you just, but you've got to be realistic as well.
Especially if you actually, if you get to the stage where you go, okay, I'm now going to put something on with professional rates.
Yeah.
And you're paying out equity rates to your actors, and you're paying out musicians' union rates to your musicians. I agree. I think there's an element of realism that needs to be kept, unfortunately.
So that's why I did The In-Between first, and I really tried to think early on with the score, okay, how big's my band going to be? So with the other show that I've sort of got the idea for, you would need quite a big cast. I think you could do it again with a similar sized band if you needed to, but you would need a bigger cast.
It sounds like you've got something which I think is sometimes quite easily overlooked by a new writer, which is business acumen. The concept of, okay, yes, I want to do this big theatre, yes, that's, I want to write something that matches the scope and the scale of what I love, but I can't do that now, so how do I get there?
I think it's slightly, I've gone for that scale in terms of story.
Yes.
But it's how can I tell that kind of story without needing a cast of 50? So, I mean, the interesting thing is that if you look at a lot of those stories, they're about 1, 2, 3 people. Like, okay, barring Les Mis has got a lot of characters.
Yes.
But, I mean, Phantom is essentially about 3 people. Wicked is, you could say, is essentially about 2 people. So I think that there's, and if I boil down the in-between, it's about 3 people. So it's just, so it doesn't necessarily mean you need lots of people, but I think you can still do that kind of story and aim for that kind of epicness, I don't know. But it's thinking about how can I do that but with a smaller cast. I suppose partly those shows are like that because they all started off as going to be big shows. Like, so Phantom was a Lloyd Webber show and it went straight to the West End.
Yes.
So you're always going to have those facilities available to you to have like a big cast and big orchestra.
But then by that point, Lloyd Webber was a known factor in
exactly.
writing.
So I don't know, it'd be interesting whether you would be able to do that with a much smaller cast, or how that would have changed the writing if they didn't have that kind of funding. But I think you would still have that core story, which is the very moving bit between those 3 characters.
Yeah.
So I don't know, I think it's sort of trying to be practical, but trying also not to compromise on the kind of story that you want to write.
Well, I think this is actually something that, in my mind, is quite well managed by Tim Minchin, having just written Matilda, because he's gone for something that is quite big. It's not.
Yeah.
Yes, he's got a big following, but he's not established. He's established as a review writer, not as a musical writer, and yet he's picked a well-known story. He's a well-known name, and he's gone for it. He's gone for a children's show as well, which is always going to pull in audiences. And so it's he's basically minimised what could go against him, which it strikes me as being the best way of doing it, and it strikes me as being kind of the approach that you've taken with this as well, which is not a bad thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, you need to think about, like, I mean, we often think of like the word compromise as being almost like a bad word.
Yeah.
Artistically, it means you're not doing the pinnacle of artistic work.
Well, I think people hear compromise, they see compromise and hear sellout.
Yeah.
Which isn't necessarily the same thing at all.
I think there's a difference between that and thinking, okay, this is the story I want to write, this is the kind of music I want to do. How can I do that most practically?
Yeah.
Because because it could be a choice between I could write a show with a cast of, like, with a huge cast and a huge band, and I'd never get to tell that story because no one would ever invest in it. But I might be able to tell that story just as well by trying to be inventive with a smaller number of people, and it doesn't mean that I compromise on the story that I'm telling. I don't know, it forces you to try and be more inventive with it, I guess. Yeah. I don't know whether that's the best way to do it, but I think it's trying to be practical at the same time as trying not to compromise artistically, I guess.
Yeah, understandable. And I suppose the last thing, which, coming back to something that we discussed earlier, and it isn't the easiest question, but are you concerned by the state of what British musical theatre is at the moment?
I don't know, it's a big question, I guess. I think there's a lot of, new writers around, which is really great, and then there's places like, Mercury Musicals and Perfect Pitch that are starting to, to support new writing, which there hasn't really been that kind of support. Particularly in the West End. I think there's more on Broadway with trying out new stuff.
Yeah.
So I think, that's good. It's starting to go in the right direction. I think from my personal point of view, as almost as an audience member, as I said, a lot of the musicals that I like are the big musicals, I guess, of like the 80s, the big hits. So I mean, I'd love to see those kind of big shows again, but I mean, I don't mean that in let's do the same thing we've done before, but I suppose sort of almost aiming for that kind of big thing.
The 2000s, 2010s, 2020s version of a 1980s big musical. Sort of like, okay, let's take an epic story, let's see what we can do with it. How can we do that today? I mean, it's difficult because of the practicality of things. So as you said, it is. But I suppose the sensible thing is to go for a show that takes 4 people and you can do with just a piano and stuff. So it's very difficult to say. Sensible and fun are not always the same thing, though. Then
you have got to weigh that up against ever getting your show put on as well.
Yeah, very true, very true.
So I suppose so that's from my personal point of view as an audience member. Those are the kinds of shows that I love going to see, and I'd love it if there were more of them to go and see. I mean, I'm happy to go and see certain shows again and again, but there's always something really special, I think, about seeing a new show.
Yeah.
So where you don't know what happens, or you haven't heard that song before, or there's something really wonderful about that. I just remember sitting in Les Mis that first time, and after that final scene with those gorgeous melodies and the harmony between like Eponine and Fontaine at the end, and I was just absolutely blown away. And I don't know, I'd love to have more of those moments where you just go and see something new and just think, wow.
Yeah.
And I think there are really great things. I saw Matilda recently. It really is as great as everyone's been saying it is, which is just fantastic. And there are so many bits in it that you just think, that is so clever, and that is so it's not been rushed. It's been really thought through, and it's so inventive. So I think things like that are great. But it's interesting that that's come from RSC as opposed to straight in the West End.
Yes.
It's interesting what we talked about earlier about transferring work, and I think sometimes starting in that smaller venue or in a subsidised venue, it just takes the pressure off a little bit in terms of allowing you to try different things creatively.
Yeah. Because
you don't. Obviously, you've still got to make your show viable financially and things like that. But I think it just adds that little bit less pressure. You don't have to fill a 2,000 seat theatre every night. You might have a 200 seat theatre every night, and so I think maybe that is the way, that as opposed to where you've got these big producers behind a show straight away, straight into the West End, that you're going to get more shows starting in more fringe venues or subsidised venues, and then maybe transferring, or maybe you'll just get more shows altogether being produced.
Possibly so.
Which is a good thing as well.
Yeah,
so,
agreed.
So that's a very long waffly answer, sorry.
No, not at all.
Just a bit of a meander. There we go. So yes, I think there are good things happening there.
Thank you very much indeed for your time. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, and I wish you all the success with, every show really, but in particular with this one. And I hope you manage to get it on its feet before too long.
Try my best.
So there you have it. The In-Between, a new musical. I think that pretty much everything I wanted to say about this has actually been said during the course of those interviews, with the exception, of course, of my opinion on the original concept album. I think that Laura has actually got a fantastic demo of the work that will be involved in the full production of the show, and also a fantastic resource to send to producers. I heartily recommend that anybody who doesn't own a copy of this already goes out and buys one. You can get the album in CD form, and it is also downloadable from iTunes. And if you do that, you will get a brilliant 7-track expose into what this musical could be if it was put on as a full production. I very much hope that a workshop happens soon, and that maybe a full production might follow relatively soon after. As a fantasy fan, for me, here is a brilliant opportunity to put a fantasy musical onto the West End stage. With Dougal Irvin's In Touch happening at the Bridewell, which you'll hear about from Foss and myself in another episode, And the possibility of this going into another theatre, maybe if a couple more of these come along, fantasy and science fiction might become slightly more of a staple in the genre. And so a couple more words by Calicus from the song that Hadley Fraser sings, Beyond the Door. What lies beyond the door? Something calls me to know more. Let what's behind this door call to you, and take the opportunity to go and find a new musical, a new style, a new plot. And with that, I'm going to leave you for this week. I thought that the interviews put forth by Lauren, Hadley and Laura were far too interesting to be sullied by me rambling on afterwards. I will no doubt be speaking to you from Edinburgh as I go up there just over a week after this episode will go out, and I look forward to putting forward some views of this year's Edinburgh Fringe shows. And don't forget, if you're up there, come and see Mr. Millennium issue number 1, which you will hear about in due course, which is playing at the Space at Surgeons Hall, venue number 53, for the duration of the Fringe, at 6:10 until the 18th, and then at 7:10 for the last week, not playing on Sundays. Thank you very much. This has been Musical Talk. I've been David Kingsmill, and I'm now off to go and read another good fantasy novel. This episode of Musical Talk presented and edited by David Kingsmill. Music copyright David Kingsmill 2012, and the lyrics to the in-between remain copyright Laura Tisdall 2012. This is Musical Talk.
And now for some musical out-talks.
I'm just going to work out what I'm going to do quickly because I can cut all this out and do chopping and changing. What about... Wow, blank. I've just accidentally deleted half a question I was going to ask you, and I've forgotten what it was. Give me a moment. Ah, spectacular fail. Never mind, it might come back to me.
Control Z.
I haven't worked out how to use one of... I've had this for 3 days, and I've never had a tablet before, so I don't know what I'm doing.
Yes, Nick Hudson, I know they're called cast recordings, so sue me.